I would like to welcome everybody to our webinar, the Hebrew University webinars. I would like to remind you that our webinars will be around an hour, half an hour of lecture by Muna Khoury-Kassabri, and then we'll open to question and answers session. You can write us your question in the chat, or you can raise your digital hand and we will open your microphones during the session. But first, I would like to present you, we have here as host Yossi. He's Vice President for Advancement and External Relations. You might know him maybe better as the Israeli famed ambassador to France and to the Netherlands, or maybe you may know him by former Director General of Israel Foreign Minister. But we all know him by our beloved Yossi. And now the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Mara. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'm really very pleased and honored to be here tonight and to introduce a close friend and a colleague at the management of the Hebrew University, Professor Mona Khoury-Kassabri. Mona has recently been appointed as Vice President for Strategy and Diversity. This is an extremely important addition to the management of the university. And she does this in addition to being the Dean of the School of Social Work and Social Welfare at the Hebrew University. Mona has for years being our guide on minority affairs and on accessibility to higher education for Arab students. And I think that she has done really wonders at Hebrew University in every one of these fields. Mona studied and got all of her degrees from Hebrew University, her bachelor degree, her master degree, her doctoral degree. And then she spent some time as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Chicago. And if I'm not mistaken, she was also visiting professor at the University of Toronto. And she is a world authority on the field she is going to speak about with countless number of publications. Her research really concentrates around issues related to child and youth welfare, and especially the area of youth at risk for becoming perpetrators and victims of violent and delinquent acts. And I think that once you listen to her, you will understand why she is held in such a high regard all around the world. So Mona, my friend, it's a pleasure. The floor is yours, and I'll be listening attentively like everybody else.
Thank you, Yossi, and thank you, Mara, for this presentation. You are really very close friend to me, and thank you for this generous speech about me. I will start my presentation, and I will love to share with you some part of my research about juvenile delinquency. And I will focus today, although my research focuses on Jewish and Arab youth, but most of the focus will be today on issues related to the Arab society in Israel. So as Yossi said, this is one part of the research that I work on. And my presentation today will focus on, actually, most of my research focuses or based on the general perception of the socio-ecological perspective to explore human behavior. And in this case, I am focusing on trying to understand juvenile delinquency based on the issue of a socio-ecological perspective, which is focusing on the child, the family, and the community factors, and other political factors that are also affecting the child's behavior. And also the base of this theory is the interaction between factors in different levels, like the child and his family, the child within the community, as I will show you today. And as I said, one of the main, I think the important parts of the research that I will show you today is what we call the effects of mediation and moderation factors, which in general, I can say it's by what we do in this, in that respect, we look at the relationship between two factors that we are sure that they are connected. And we try to find whether this connection is different in different contexts, as I will show you later in my presentation. And the third part, so as I was talking before, so the third part of my presentation is just looking about gender differences. We know that females are less involved than males in a delinquency, but our question is whether they are affected by the same risk factors and protective factors. So before I will start, I would just, for those of you who are not familiar with Israeli society, although I believe that most of the people here know that, so the population in Israel is almost 9 million, and the Palestinian Arab minority in Israel comprises about 20% of the total population. And one of the main characteristics of this population is that it's a very young population. We know that children in the Arab society make up 28% of the child population in Israel, which is something that is very important to keep in mind when we are talking about also the larger situation in Israel that we will have also in few years. The Arab population will not remain 20%, it will be much larger. And another factor relates to the socio-economic situation of the Arab population. We know that compared with the Jewish majority, the community, the Arab community is characterized by higher rates of poverty and unemployment, and enjoying much lower governmental expenditure of public funds for health, education, and social services. And when we talk about education, for those of you who are not familiar with the education system in Israel, it's a separate education system. And one of the main factors, again, that characterize this education system is the gap between the Jewish and the Arab education system. The Arab schools tend to have larger classes and less funds given by the government, and other factors that differentiate between them, such as Arab teachers are less taking in-service training compared to the Jewish teachers. So this is in general the socioeconomic status differences. And the last thing that we should know about the Arab minority is that in general, it's characterized by traditional cultural values. But again, the Arab society has been going into a rapid process of modernization that affected some of the groups in the Arab society, which also resulted in a gap between parents and children, and between the older and the young generation. And in some cases, it also was one of the aspects that we, the researchers, look at and try to find out how these changes have affected the Arab community. So what we know about minorities and delinquencies, many of the things that I'm going to say here about the Arab minority in Israel are also relevant to other minorities in the States, in Canada, and many other countries in the world. We know that, first of all, it's something that related to the general perception or the data about juvenile delinquency, contrary to what many people believe. And actually, what we hear usually in the news, that juveniles are very much involved in delinquency. And in this figure, actually, I just want to show that we can see that actually the involvement of juveniles in delinquency also in Israel has been decreasing during the years. And this trend, it's not only special to Israel, it is also it was found also in other countries in the world, including the States. And if we look at the differences between comparing what completing what I said earlier, if we can look at the numbers, because you might think that the percentage is smaller because even though more kids are involved, but the population is getting larger. So to show that this is not a reason for the decrease, and it's a real decrease, that also looking at the numbers of suspects, we can see that they are decreasing. So it means that although remember that the population is increasing, so we know that in general, we see that youth are less involved in delinquency. And if we look at the differences between the Jewish and Arab population, we can see that the Arab population is involved much more than the percentage in the population. When we see that almost 40% of the suspects are Arabs in 2018, remember that the children or this group of children might arrive to 25% of youth in this age group compared to 40% of suspects. So the study that I'm talking about, I will not get into details into the methodological part of it, just to remind you that I'm not talking about small numbers of youth who participated. In this study, I have a sample of almost 3,200 students, age 11 to 18, who were sampled from their schools, and they also have answered a structured anonymous self-reported questionnaire. And we had 60% almost of the participants were females. So when we talk about juvenile delinquency in the Arab community, I think we should remember, and maybe this is something that will remind many of us what has happened during the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks. Youth in the Arab society are involved or exposed to a very high percent of violence in their community. When I say community, we ask them about their neighborhood. And if you look at the data, it's really compared also to other parts in the world, it's very high. Almost 1 out of 2 students said they were involved, they were exposed directly to violence. This means they were victims of violence in their neighborhood. And almost 80% of the 3,200 students said that they were exposed to indirect violence, meaning they know someone who were attacked, they know someone who was humiliated or other things of violence in their community. And another part that also we should talk about it, and it's again related to what we have been seeing lately, we asked students about experiencing discrimination. And almost 45% of the students said that they had experienced personal victimization for being Arab. And when we ask them about their families, we noticed that almost 40% said that they know that their parents or their family members were exposed to discrimination. So how these 2 factors are related to delinquency? We added these 2 important factors to a large model, which was part of a PhD of my students. And we tried to check how these factors actually predict serious physical violence. And the focus of this research was on serious physical violence, because when we compare between Jewish and Arab students in the level of involvement in violence, we can see that while we see that they almost have the same level of a moderate physical violence, which we say that the everyday violence, pushing others and attacking like moderately others. But when we look at serious physical violence, we see that significantly Arab students are more involved. So what we have seen here as predicting their involvement, of course, first thing, feeling discriminated. we saw that youth who feel discriminated were more violent than others. Direct exposure to violence was also related, and indirect exposure. But the important part is that all these three factors actually increased what we called normative beliefs of aggression. The more you were discriminated and the more you were exposed to violence in your community, you believed that violence is a good thing, if I will frame it like simply. And the more you feel that violence is something that should be used in different situations, and this is the higher you believe in that, more you are more involved in serious physical violence. Two important things that we also saw here. Of course, we saw that males are more involved in serious physical violence than females. And also we saw that males have larger support of normative beliefs of aggression. But contrary to what we all might think, the socioeconomic status of the students was not related, not to the normative beliefs and not to the involvement in serious physical violence. It means that the other factors are much more important, and when we control for them, the socioeconomic status will not be significant. Other part of my research, I'm not sure if you know the people here in the pictures, but for the Israeli audience, they are very familiar with them. And usually when I say, I can't see your faces here, but usually when I say what goes through our mind when we hear the word religion and delinquency, usually we think of people that we see in the news, that they were secular, and when they were committing a crime and getting into jail, they became more religious. And usually people believe that when you ask about this, that there is a relationship between their involvement in delinquency or in crime and being religious. And actually the research, my research in that field, in this specific research, but in many other research that I have been doing with colleagues, also focusing on the Jewish population, the Arab population, the Muslim population, the Christian population within the Arab community, and also within the Jewish community. I have a student that he is doing his PhD on delinquency among ultra-Orthodox youth. And the same trend we have seen, the more religious the youth, the less they are involved in violence. And something that we didn't ask in this specific study, but I have explored that in another study in East Jerusalem. Also, the more religious youth were either less involved in political violence, or their religiosity was not at all related to a political violence, which is contrary to what we might usually think, that religiosity is very much related or correlated to a political violence. Another important factor that we have been seeing in the literature, and it's consistent also here, that affiliation with delinquent peers is increasing the likelihood of involvement in all violent types. So you all might say, okay, we know that affiliation with delinquent peers and community violence is related to juvenile delinquency. But one of the questions that I said that I'm interested in is that we know that affiliation is related to serious physical violence, affiliation with delinquent peer. But I want to expand this literature by looking at what we call it moderating factor. And in this case, I took the religiosity as a moderating factor, and I asked whether this relationship is stronger or weaker among religious youth. So in this graph, we can see that the more religious the youth who participated in the study, the weaker the relationship between being affiliated with delinquent peers and involving in serious physical violence. It means that you can be a friend with the same peer group, but if you are a religious child or youth, your religiosity acts as a protective factor against your peers. Another important thing that I asked in my research is that we know, and you all might know, okay, we know that exposure to community violence is related to being involved in violence. We know it's based on many of the social learning theories. So we want to ask whether there are factors that we as social workers can work on, because I can't now change the whole community. We try, we have a social work in the community, but we can work in that respect, but we also know that we can work in other factors and maybe our effect might be faster. So one of these factors was the parent support. And if you look again at this interaction model, we can see that the same children who were living in high community, community with high levels of violence, when they have strong support from their parents, their level of involvement in violence was lower. It means that we know that the community affects their children, but families can act as resilient factors or protective factors, helping their children when they live in these circumstances. I will not go into details, but we see that the effects of parents is the same thing for other factors. When we talk also about cyberbullying, when we know that parent monitoring was also a moderating factor, as you can see here, in the relationship between also being impulsive and the violence, which usually think that you can't affect youth impulsivity, but we know that even though the more impulsive the child, the more they were involved in cyberbullying, which is another kind of violence that I have been studying lately, and also in many of my research in Canada is focusing on cyberbullying. And we see that children who have high monitoring from their parents, and I would emphasize here, when we talk about monitoring in that respect, it's not monitoring their internet use, which usually it's not helpful in decreasing their involvement in cyberbullying. We talk about monitoring, which is general monitoring, that parents know where are their children, they tell them where are they going, who are their friends, and this kind of monitoring. And when the parents act this way, the level of involvement or the relationship between impulsivity and cyberbullying is weaker than among children that they have low parental monitoring. Another thing that I have studied in my research is trying, as I said, to look at the socio-ecological perspective that I have been using myself and many other colleagues and theoretical researchers in the field, looking at the socio-ecological perspective and trying to explain in general youth involvement in violence. And I just said, okay, let's take this theory and try to see whether the same relationships exists also among females and males, because we know that, like asking who will be affected more by parental support, males or females? Usually, if I could see you, I would ask you to answer, but I can't see you here. So I assume that you might say females. Many of the people that I have asked, especially in the Arab society, because the females have a strong relationship with their families, we expect them to be more affected by this aspect. But contrary to what I myself assumed, we saw that parental support was associated with lower levels of violence only for males. For females, it wasn't associated with their involvement in violence. It means that Arab males who have support from their parents might be affected by this support more than the females. And it goes contrary to what we intuitively might expect. But when we think about it deeply, we can see that it's something that is not usual to have it as a male in traditional society, this support. So when you have it, it affects you much more because, as I said, in the Arab society, females are more affected or they have more parental support than males, and they are also more monitored than males. So another thing that we saw that impulsivity as a factor, we know that it increases the level of involvement in violence, but we noticed that impulsivity is stronger in predicting severe and moderate violence, which is for males, when you are impulsive, you are more physically violent. And for females, when you are impulsive, you don't use physical violence, you use indirect violence, which means also here that females know the expectation of them, they internalize them, and then when they are impulsive, they also act according to what expected, and they don't use physical violence, they use indirect violence. We also saw that, interestingly, more males than females say that they are affiliated with delinquent peers, and more males say that they are exposed to community violence. But when we compare the relationship between these factors and violence among males and females, we saw that the relationship is almost similar. It means that affiliation with delinquent peer, even you have more delinquent peers, when you are female or males, it's enough to have fewer friends that might affect you. And this is the case of females. It's enough to have 2 delinquent friends, and you might be affected as males who have 5 delinquent friends. And the same for community violence. And in this case, we know that Arab students, as I showed you, they are exposed to very high levels of community violence. And even though females are exposed to lower level of community violence, we know that it might be that their level of exposure is relatively so high, despite the fact that it's lower than for males. So if I would summarize my talk and discuss these differences, one of the things, the important parts is studying violence from a wider perspective. We always say that also when I started studying school violence, community violence, and other types, and cyberbullying, the studies that when researchers started working in that field, they focused on the internet use. And my studies actually said, and the message of my research was, it's a youth behavior that is happening in another space, but it doesn't mean that it's not affected by many of the other factors that we have been learning about and finding that they are related to youth behavior, such as exposure to community violence. In the research that I showed you earlier in the graph about community violence, we saw that also youth who are exposed to community violence, they were more involved in cyberbullying. It means, again, this exposure actually increases the numbers of their involvement in different kinds of violence, and one of them is cyberbullying. That it's happening in their computers, in their phones, or other places. It doesn't mean that it's not related to their life and their general lives as students, as children, and other factors. Other important thing that also is related somehow to what we have seen in Israel lately, and what I have been talking about for many, at least in the last 2 years, when we talk about the increase of violence in the Arab society. And we saw that the model that I showed you earlier, this one, in this model, if you notice that I told you we ask Arab youth in their schools, it means that most of their violence was directed toward Arab children, and feeling discriminated, it's something that happened by the Jewish population in Israel toward them as an Arab minority in Israel, but their violent act usually is against their group. And in this case, they are violent toward their friends. And how it's connected, this is connected to what I said in the last 2 years. I said that in some place, this violence might go out, will not remain in the community. And I think we have seen that lately. Another thing that we should notice is the effect of impulsivity. And I showed you in one example that parental monitoring might affect impulsivity. Usually when we know that there are an impulsive child, we say that we can't do anything. And in my research, I saw that even if you have the same level of impulsivity, you can also moderate this level of impulsivity or its effect by being more supportive, more a monitoring parent than other parents. And we know that there are two risk factors are very important, very consistent in the literature by their effect on the behavior and its delinquent peers and exposure to community violence. But we also have seen the importance of parenting in moderating different effects of factors such as community violence. I believe that in many cases we see that we know that the Arab children are exposed to very high levels of community violence. Let's think what we can do now to help them in that respect. And one of the things that we found here is working with parents. So the whole programs and their intervention programs should also focus not only on the child, it will not help him as much as intervention programs that includes the parents and also community social work or intervention. And the last thing is the gender and violence. We see and we know that girls are less involved in violence than boys, but we saw that also they are affected by different factors. There are factors that they are both affected, such as peer and community violence, as I said earlier, but there are other factors that affecting them differently or other factors that are not affecting them, such as what I said earlier about parental support. So thank you very much. I tried to make it in 30 minutes as we promised, and I'm looking forward to hear your questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Mona. It was really interesting and so linked to the actual news we had in the last weeks. So we now open to question and answer. You're welcome to write your questions or raise your digital hands. Or maybe Yossi, if you are with us, would you like to add something?
Well, first of all, I want to thank Mona for this brilliant presentation, and I take the liberty of asking the first question, which is not necessarily related to the presentation. Mona, how optimistic are you that following this several weeks of very problematic weeks in the relationships between Jews and Arabs here, how optimistic are you that things will get better in the near future?
You know me, Yossi, I'm a very optimistic person. And as the Dean of the School of Social Work, I should believe in human being and in our ability to make a change. And I think that we can do it, and we can use what happened lately as an opportunity to make a change. Because in the past we lived that is everything is okay, it's quiet here, and we don't need to intervene. Now we know as a fact that without intervening, this will happen again. So you can't keep it this way. So my optimistic part is coming with an action part.
Okay.
I can see that we have a few questions now. I would like to open the microphone to Mr. Fran Rich. You can open your microphone now and talk, Mr. Rich. Oh, you should open your microphone too. Okay, in the meanwhile, we have another question from Mr. David Last. He's asking, you found that religiosity is related to lower involvement in violence, but are there religious leaders or groups that incite violence?
when it's actually, usually I'm asked about this. And when I say religiosity, it's interesting. I would love also in one time to study what religiosity does to people when they see this result. They usually ask things in that direction. Of course, religious people, as other politicians, as other people, incite for violence. We know that. But when I study violence and religiosity, I focus on one important part of religiosity, and it's the belief in religious acts and behaviors and in things that are not only calling yourself religious person. This way I show these pictures, and we know usually that many people call themselves religious people, but they don't follow the religious rules. And what I found in my research, that the more the youth are believing in religious rules, acts, behaviors, the lower they are involved in violence. It doesn't mean that there are a lot of people who call themselves religious that they are not involved in violence at all, in general, not only this kind. And also we should remember that we are not talking about casualty. So it's something that predicts lower levels of violence, but we should remember that there are many other factors related to this behavior.
So Muna, you were absolutely right, and most of the questions are concerning the religiosity and the link to violence. So David last was, his question is asking now if you mean religious observance. This is what you mean when you say that only people who really observe religious are less violence. And
we are not talking about fundamentalism, if we are asking about that. This is not what we asked about extreme belief in religiosity, like ISIS, using religion for political use. We don't ask about this. We ask about regular behaviors and belief in religious acts. This is what we ask more.
Okay, which I think this answer to the other question also by Anne Val and by Ugo Grigio. I would like to let Mr. Rich to ask his question. Would you like now to open your microphone? Let's see. No. Can't. So, okay. So you can write more questions if you have, of course, either in the chat or in the question and answer box.
Mara, if I'm not mistaken, Fran is a lady and not a lesbian.
I'm sorry. I thought it's like Francesco or Francis. That's why. I'm really sorry. So
whatever.
Okay, but not yet.
He's saying that David is saying that they are not allowed to open the mic. Maybe you can open that for them, Mara.
I did for Francis Rich, so she can open. The other people, only if you raise your hand, I can open your microphone. Okay, but not yet.
There is a question, maybe meanwhile I can answer that, what we can do in order to decrease violence. So as I said, if you ask me now, you give me all the funds and resources and you say like, give me, I will start with young children. I will start in early childhood. I will start there and I will start intervening in kindergartens. Even before that, when I did my postdoc, I was involved in intervention program for mothers at risk who actually, the intervention focused on them when they were pregnant. The program found those parents or mothers who are at risk for being, after that, for putting their children at risk for violence, for delinquency, for other risk factors, and they escort them when they were pregnant, and the intervention continued after they gave birth, and they continued with them in their early childhood. So we can start there, but of course we can't keep all the others and say, okay, now we're only intervening with the young children. We also should continue working with youth and children in schools. We know that the Israeli Ministry of Education has implemented many intervention programs to intervene and try to decrease the involvement of youth and the students in violence. And the studies have shown that we can see that there is a decrease in youth, in Israeli students' involvement in violent behavior. So we can, when you do actions, first of all, we should believe that we can work on that and we can help the students. We can say, many people say, okay, there is violence, but we can't help them because their parents are violent, and we can do that. In other research that I worked on, we saw that also schools have an important and significant effect on students, even if you don't intervene with parents. So we should remember that students spend more time in school than in their home.
That's right.
Not during the last year.
Yes. Hopefully from next year we will go back to normal.
Yeah.
So we have Naomi Sharir. You can ask your question.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you very much for an eye-opener lecture. Speaking to you from Toronto. I can't see myself. I don't know if, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So thank you very much. And I wanted, as a retired teacher, to focus on the educational aspects. I agree that education is fundamental in changing things, especially, as you said, at home. But what about schools, where I read that the books actually in schools, there is some hatred towards the Israeli society, where kids are learning calculating, kind of, if you kill three Israelis, and someone else kills another three, then how many is it altogether? So the more the better. So what can be done in regards to the education? And at the same point, I understand that the more and more from the Arab society are getting into university and becoming professionals compared to previous years. So how would you explain that?
So if I refer to your first question, actually, I learned in the Arab education system, I have never seen what you have just mentioned. We don't learn in this, and the books are the books of the Ministry of Education. When you talk about, I'm not sure whether you are talking about students who study in the Palestinian Authority and not within Israel. The study that I presented is talking about students who study in the Israeli education system, which all the books and all the materials are confirmed by the ministry. And we have the same math books, the same science books, maybe history, we have different books, but also they are approved by the Ministry of Education. So I'm not sure, I haven't seen this example ever in like any presentation that I have been working on. I know that there are some people talking about these kind of things, that they heard about things happening in the Palestinian Authority. The books, there are a researcher at the Hebrew University, Dr. Samira Alayan, had studied the books, and looking at the materials in the books, there is no mention of these kind of things. Maybe teachers try to be creative, and we know that it happens in both sides. But in the books themselves, they are not written in this way.
Okay. Referring to the larger number of academicians amongst the Arab society, I mean, there was a claim that there wasn't enough money put into Arab schools and compared to the Jewish schools, etc. But the numbers are growing.
Yeah, the numbers are growing, which is a very good thing. But as you see, the investment in this respect is coming from the government led by Benjamin Netanyahu, by saying that actually he is confirming what you just said. We didn't invest much in the Arab society. This is why their levels of graduation from high school and all other in the higher education are very low. And in order to fix this thing, we have to invest more money in interventions that will help increasing the numbers of Arab students in higher education. We have seen a huge change in the numbers, but it doesn't mean that we have reached our percentage in the population. Increase doesn't mean that we are equal. Increase, it means, as I said, also decrease in numbers of juveniles involved in violence. This doesn't mean that we don't have now juveniles involved in violence, just the numbers are decreasing. And the same thing for Arabs in the education system. We have seen an increase in number of people who have their Bagrut, the final exams, but it doesn't mean, we know that only 50% of students in the Arab schools complete 12 years of education. So increase doesn't mean that we are in the perfect place.
No, I understand, but it's a good thing.
Of course.
If there are no
trend, it's a good trend and we should continue.
If I may just add that we at Hebrew University, of course, attach tremendous importance to the enrollment of Arab students at the university. But exactly as Mona said, even though the figures and the numbers are increasing, they are not yet representing the percentage of the Arabs in the population. But we at Hebrew U are very pleased to see about 16% of our students are Arabs, and you can find them in almost every discipline. You'll find them in pharmaceutical, you'll find them in dentistry, you'll find them in education, in social work, and we should, because we deeply believe in the importance of education, we are committed to doing everything possible to integrate more of them in at the Hebrew University.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mona, we have a few more questions in the question and answer box. Maybe if you would like to answer to the question, if you can explore what kind of discrimination people experience.
So we asked them, the students, about their personal experience, about their family and the parents' experience, and we asked them whether they got worse service because they are Arabs, whether they feel they did treated badly because they are Arabs, whether they were not allowed to get service from official services because they are Arab. These kind of things that we have around 10 items asking about being exposed to discrimination. We focused because they are Arabs. In my students, actually, now I have a student that she's writing her PhD. She's also asking about discrimination for being female in the Arab society, which will be interesting when she will complete her PhD to show the competing effect of being a minority within a minority. So, but this kind of things that we have asked.
Thank you. There is a very political question, but I think the answer is that we don't know. That is, if Naftali Bennett becomes prime minister, is his policy to increase resource to the Arab education sector? We hope so, but I guess that nobody really can answer.
I wish I know the answer. Maybe Benjamin Netanyahu knows that. You can ask them. Maybe Naftali Bennett also. I'm not sure, you know. He might be surprising. If I would look at the default answer, I would say I'm not sure. But people here in the political atmosphere in Israel are very surprising sometimes. As I said, like the investment in the education in the Arab society comes from this government, and we can see that sometimes good things happen.
Okay, and maybe we can go to our last question. We have What about youth who have committed acts of violence and are detained? I guess the meaning is what happened to them.
So we have the special law for juveniles who are involved in violence. They are treated differently than adults. We have the juvenile law, and it's a very the focus of our law is treatment than punishment, which is different than the American law, which is more, the focus of it is on punishment than treatment. So youth who are involved in delinquency and they have been in the criminal process, they are treated by a social worker who is the probation officer, who also involved also in the evaluation that will be sent to the בית משפט?
The court.
The court, I'm sorry, I had to look up. So that will be sent to the court, and he also responsible for giving treatment after the decision of the judge.
Thank you, Mona. Yes, Yossi, would you like to add something?
Well, just to thank Mona and to thank each and every one of you for partaking in this very interesting, and it's, I would say, even more than interesting. It is the future of this country that we are talking about. So thank you for taking part. Thank you, Mona. Thank you, Mara, for organizing this, and we'll see you on our next webinar. Toda rabah.
Thank you, everybody. You will receive the recording in the next days, and you are welcome to share it because I think we had a very important webinar today. Thank you, Mona.
Thank you all, and see you in another occasion. Thank you.
Bye.
Good.